What's up, everyone? In my last video, I reacted to a video called "The End of Everything," but it was actually not about the end of everything. It was the end of a series of lectures. So I thought I'd check out the first lecture and go from there. So this is from Santa Fe Institute, some kind of event they had, I guess, with several lectures about the collapse of systems, I guess. And so here we go. This is Ricardo Hausmann.
I've been.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That's that for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here. I've been thinking about economic collapse, precisely because of Venezuela, and as I'm going to show you, you learn a lot about non-collapse when you think about collapse. I mean, it's if you can explain why things collapse too easily, then collapse should be very frequent, right? But it's not that frequent, so thank God. So, but it makes it harder to explain. So, we know about some collapses in history. The Vikings apparently discovered North America. They arrived here in Newfoundland, and they left us with this remark, that there's nothing left from that visit, from that those societies imploded. There were some people living in Easter Island. There were no people anymore after a while, so we know about those collapses. But when the English arrived, apparently they settled more or less, and they very quickly started to trade with the locals. And here are a bunch of images of them trading with the locals and buying fur from the locals, because very quickly they got into a completely different dynamic in which the local population started to use horses, which were not there before, and started to use guns, which were not there before, which made hunting that much more effective, and which meant that they started trading and so on. And through that mechanism, trade maybe, things were made to survive more easily. Economic science, as we know it, was probably founded by Adam Smith, some precursors and so on. And I want to put to you that Adam Smith was probably the first complexity thinker. Adam Smith came up with this idea of the invisible hand. I had a lot of trouble finding on the web a picture of the invisible hand. But the secret of the invisible hand is that systems can self-organize. The complex systems are hard to centrally organize, but they have some capacity to self-organize. And in particular, the economy can self-organize because it has really three elements that form the basis of this self-organization. The first one is that goods are traded with a price, and price provides information about people's willingness to pay, about the relative cost of things, and so on and so forth. Goods are provided by firms that are motivated by profit. Now, what is profit? Profit is the difference between the value of the output and the value of the input. So the value of the output at a certain price and the value of the input. So profit depends on prices. But profit is an incentive motive. It's something that makes you want to respond to the information that is contained in prices. And then there are capital markets that are looking around for people who are expected to be profitable, which happen to be those that are expected to respond adequately to the information contained in prices. So that's sort of like this negative feedback loop that sort of like keeps things together, right? Now, to me, that seems a little bit related when you talk about how a complex system works in practice, a little bit related to autocatalysis, in the sense that autocatalysis is an autocatalytic set, is a set, not an individual molecule, but a set of molecules or entities that can create themselves, that can recreate themselves. So you cannot create yourself, but a set can recreate itself. And that's a little bit what an economy is. I mean, it can, the atoms are not the same as yesterday, everything is not the same as yesterday, but today it's self-similar to yesterday, right? Somehow this thing sort of like replicated itself. And if you download something about autocatalytic sets from a very reputable publication called Wikipedia, it's a set of chemical reactions can be said to be collectively autocatalytic if a number of those reactions produce as reaction products catalysts for enough of the other reactions that the entire set of chemical reactions is self-sustaining. Okay, so we need to look at these sets of of interrelated reactions that allow the whole to happen. We see it very intuitively. For example, I move my muscle. Why do I move my muscle? Well, because my muscles have access to oxygenated blood. And without oxygenated blood, I cannot move my muscles. But how did the oxygenated blood get to the muscle? Well, because I have some muscles that make me breathe and some muscles that make me pump. So the muscles make the oxygenated blood that make the muscles move, right? So you have these cycles. So why do I mention this? Is because when we're going to see a collapse, something happens to this autocatalytic process. Something breaks down in the process. There has to be some breakdown in some part of the process, and then when that thing breaks down, everything breaks down because it no longer can recreate itself. So
this is great analysis. I really appreciate the connecting of disciplines. That's what's most important for understanding, is to not just look at one discipline, the economics, and say this is how the economy works, but to actually look at some other discipline, which he's looking at, chemistry, to decipher some interconnected relationships so that parallels can be drawn, so that greater understanding can be arrived at about how the economy functions, by also incorporating information from other aspects of all aspects of everything, because all is one, everything is interconnected, everything is connected. And so how those things are connected is in ways like this, where we can then actually connect different disciplines to see the parallels and to actually create those pathways in our mind so that we are able to have access to those roads. And that basically allows for the flow of energy, of information, to increase, because then our capacity is higher. As well as just we have more roads, so there's more understanding when we cross disciplines, because if we just studied economics but didn't make parallels to other disciplines, then we would miss these parallels and therefore have less understanding. But because we are drawing these parallels, it actually increases the amount of understanding that we have in ways that only by drawing those parallels can we do. So I really appreciate this. This is awesome already. This is very in line with what I feel is vital for actually studying systems like the economy. We can't do it in a vacuum. We have to recognize its connectedness to everything. And reactions are, to me, I always have thought of reactions in terms of just the simple A plus B equals C kind of thing, where there's an activation energy. And so any reaction that occurs mentally has that same A plus A state of mind plus new information plus activation energy, which is focus and paying attention. When we actually put the energy into it to learn something new, we're putting energy in. And that's the activation energy that then allows for the actual reaction to proceed, where then we learn the new information. Okay.
So in order to produce, you need inputs, and you can bring in those inputs in containers. You need some workers. Maybe you need some money to pay them and so on. You need some infrastructure to move things around. You need security, because otherwise people won't show up and it'll be too dangerous. And maybe you need some institutional framework to have contracts and award results and so on. It says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a picture of the happiness, I guess. But in order to have happiness, you need to have security, and in order to have security, you need to have police force. In order to pay a police force, you need taxes. In order to pay taxes, you need production. So without production, you don't have taxes. Without taxes, you don't have production. You have the same sum. So
Did you just say without taxes you don't have production?
let me go quick. Yeah. So one way to think of these cycles is, you say you own a car, you have nothing to do, so you decide to become an Uber driver. So you become an Uber driver, and what you need to drive, you have your car, so drive your Uber. Well, you need gasoline. Well, suppose you don't have gasoline. Well, if you don't have gasoline, your car goes unused and your labor goes unused because you don't have gasoline. And the whole cycle breaks down, right? If I give you some money to buy the gasoline, you would be able to pay the money back, and you're back, because you'll be able to make enough money out of driving the Uber to pay for the gasoline and so on. So you're home free. So you have these things that, when they work. So, fish don't know they are in water. They work. When they break down, you realize what were the interconnections that you needed to keep in mind. So you think, for example, this is very, very dear to the heart of Venezuelans, Scotch whiskey. We used to be the largest per capita consumer of Scotch whiskey. But in order to make Scotch whiskey, you need malted barley. In order to make malted barley, you need barley. Now, a very interesting factoid about the world is that Scotland doesn't make barley. So Scotland doesn't make barley. These are the producers of barley in the world. They don't make barley. They make whiskey. How do they make the whiskey? Well, they make whiskey with whiskey, right? They make whiskey, they sell the whiskey, and with the whiskey, they buy barley, and right? So you don't need barley to make whiskey anymore. If you're sufficiently connected to other things, you're sort of like autocatalytic set simplifies, which is the reason why I think that the British survived in the Americas and the Vikings didn't. That they could, through trade, simplify the autocatalytic set needed for survival. And that's why Jamestown probably didn't survive and Boston did survive and so on. I don't know enough about North American history, but these things are probably there. So in comes Venezuela. Venezuela, this is people trying to get food. This is when they get to the end of the line. This is when they get through the line. So there's not enough food around, so people, there are tons of pictures of people eating from the garbage, and then people just leave the country. So how the upper middle income country with the largest oil reserves in the world, how the hell can you get such a collapse? So first question is, how extraordinary is this collapse? And I'm going to tell you how I'm going to measure things. So I'm going to have time series of GDP, total output of the economy, and I'm going to start a clock when GDP goes down, and I'm going to wait until GDP goes back up, and then I stop the clock, and then I'm going to measure how long was this crisis, and I'm going to measure how deep was this crisis, peak to trough, and I'm going to measure this area under the curve, which is sort of like how much output was lost as a percentage of 1 year's GDP. Now, we all understand collapse and crisis because we're all old enough to have gone through the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and look at all the consequences it had. So we get a sense of, we know what a crisis is. So this is the US Great Recession. GDP, it lasted 3 years. GDP fell 3.1%, and the total area under the curve was 4%. So, whatever you think that brought and so on, unemployment, this, that, and the other, catastrophe, associate those numbers to it.
4% of what?
4% of 1 year's output. Yeah, I could have, history defaulted on its promises, if you want. I could have had, but I'm going to be a very conservative measure of things. So this is Spain and Greece. In Spain, it fell by almost 9%, and it took 9 years to recover, and it lost 41% of 1 year's output. And Greece lost 27%. It declined by 27%, and by the time I made the number, it had lost 150% of GDP, but it's still counting, right? So this is the US Great Depression. The US Great Depression saw a decline of 29%. Okay, so it's 10 times bigger than the US Great Recession. So we get some numbers on. This is the Spanish Civil War. It had 29% decline. So 1 million people died. So these are big numbers. These are the biggest crises in Latin America. In Chile, it had 2 crises in the 70s and in the 80s where it lost 15% of GDP. So it's 5 US Great Recessions. And this is the biggest crisis in Latin America. In 2002, it was Argentina. It lost 18.8%. So I'm just giving you some numbers. So, what is a big number? What's normal? No. So now we know 3% is what we have an experience of, a personal experience of. These numbers are much, much bigger. This is Venezuela. The collapse has been 61%. The area under the curve to date, it's 186% of GDP and counting, and it's been 7 years, and it will take many, many more years before you recover. To go up after having gone down 66%, it means that you have to go up 200%. So it'll be a while. So it's an inordinately weird event. Inordinately weird. If I look at all my data set for the world, there are very few instances in which you see a crisis bigger than this one. So Liberia, Georgia, Tajikistan, Iraq, and Libya. What do these things have in common? Well, either there were wars, or there was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that you created borders where there were no borders. You cut commercial links where commercial links were normal. You created money where that money did not exist before because every country had to have its own currency and so on. So that's the former Soviet Union. And the other ones in red are countries in crisis. So the question is, why the hell would a country without a crisis, without a war, without a collapse of its institutions and so on, why the hell would it drop? Considering that it had just ended, the recession started in 2013, at the end, towards the end of the largest oil boom in history, which went from 2004 to 2014. And we got into a recession in 2013 when the price of oil was above 100, and we are an oil exporter. So why the hell? How can you do that? I'm going to tell you what the story I came up with. And the first one is an attack on the invisible hand. The attack on the invisible hand eliminated the feedback loops that keep a situation stable. You saw the Great Depression. It went down, it went back up, as if nothing had happened. You kicked the Spanish Civil War. It went down. It kind of went back up. 9 years, 7 years, 8 years. That's more or less the time scale that David would look at. So first is the attack on the invisible hand. What did that mean? Well, you control prices. You control profits. You control the financial system. You expropriate 6 million hectares of land, the whole steel sector, the whole cement sector, the whole oil sector, the oil service sector, the agro-service sector. So you expropriate a lot of stuff. You command it through, so not terribly central command, but you eliminate the invisible hand. You eliminate that invisible hand, and you start doing that before the oil price goes up. But after the oil price went up in 2004, you went through an orgy of expropriations and controls. When foreign exchange was super ample, they imposed exchange controls and import controls and everything controls. So that attack on economic rights caused a decline in output in the middle of the boom, a decline in the output of things that could be imported, like food, agriculture, and manufacturing. And I'm going to show you that. But since the price of oil was high, it didn't matter. So you take over the steel sector stops working, you can import steel. Right? So you take over the agricultural sector, starts malfunctioning, doesn't matter, you import food. And you can because prices of oil are high. So because this was not enough, they started to borrow. And in the middle of the boom, you look very solvent, very good, very creditworthy, so you start borrowing. And they sextupled the public external debt. It went from something like $25 billion to $160 billion in the middle of the oil boom. So instead of putting some money aside for a rainy day, they borrowed. And they borrowed in part because they were destroying the invisible hand and compensating for it. But eventually this debt led to over-indebtedness, and capital markets said, enough is enough. You've borrowed enough. We don't think you're good for more. And that caused what economists call a sudden stop in capital flows. And that triggered the recession, with the price of oil still at 100. With the government no longer willing, they were spending in, say, 2012, as if the price of oil was at 200 when it was at 100. So in 2013, capital markets said, no more money, so they couldn't spend as if the price of oil was at 200, so they had to cut imports. With the cut of imports, GDP collapsed. And in 2014, the price of oil collapsed. So now you had a very fragile economy that could no longer import. Now, imports are things like barley. Without malted barley, you cannot make a whiskey and you cannot make beer. We don't make whiskey, but we do make beer, and we like our beer. So if you can't import, you can't produce. If you can't produce, GDP collapses. If GDP collapses, tax revenues on that GDP collapse, which was also affected by the fact that oil prices collapse. So if tax revenues collapse and you have a government, what do you need to do? Well, you need to print money. So you print money to cover the deficit. That led to hyperinflation. Last year we had 1.7 million% inflation. That led to wiping out all the savings and a dramatic contraction of the financial system, which worsened the GDP collapse. So that's my story of what happened in Venezuela. I can show you the numbers.
That's a great analysis. Seems spot on, I'd say.
Numbers, if in black here is the GDP. In the middle of the boom, GDP was going almost nowhere, but consumption, public and private consumption were booming because we were spending the oil money. But that did not translate into an output boom because the invisible hand was being destroyed. During the boom, manufacturing collapsed, agriculture collapsed. That's what I'm showing there. During the booms, imports boomed to compensate. So we went, and during the boom, we borrowed like crazy. So this is the foreign external debt. It went from 25 billion to the 160 billion I told you. And the public debt became the largest public debt in the world, measured as a share of export. So debt to export ratios, it's in unit of years. So it went to something like 5 years of export. Now it's probably 8 years of exports because exports have collapsed. But it beats everybody else in the world. So it's the most over-indebted country in the world. So when when exports collapsed and access to financing collapsed, then imports collapsed dramatically. Output that didn't boom during the boom did collapse during the collapse. And that led to reductions in food production, in food imports of 70%. These are some of the items on medicines of 80% by now. These numbers are to 2016. It was 85% by 2017. And these are some of the things they cut out. Not only this autocatalytic set was destroyed because there was not enough oil revenue, they didn't invest enough in oil to keep oil production. And they couldn't invest efficiently in oil because they had nationalized everybody who knew how to provide services and drill and so on. So oil production, which was 3.4 million barrels when Chavez came to power in 1999, was last month 700,000 barrels. So here I have in blue the collapse in oil tax revenues. So the collapse in oil tax revenues non-oil tax revenues went from something like $8 billion to $1 billion. So they declined to 1/8 of what they were. And they were very partially substituted by this red line, which is the dollar value of money printing. So they printed money, and inflation went from 100% to 1.7 million%. So they were printing money at an accelerating pace, but I calculated this in dollars. The dollars were also skyrocketing. So they essentially print something like the equivalent of $4 billion a year in money. But in order to collect $4 billion in seigniorage, we call that seigniorage, they needed a 1.7 million% inflation. These are sort of like the highest inflation rates that I can have in the world data sets. So there are only some weird instances in the Weimar Republic in the 20s, in Hungary in 1947. There are very few instances in which inflation has been higher than the one we have just observed. This is a financial system. It had assets greater than $70 billion by 2012. The last number is less than $1 billion. So it went to 1/70th of its value. And this is what the minimum wage buys. The government has just announced not only a minimum wage, but a maximum public sector wage, which is less than 2 minimum wages. And this is, the first column is Colombia. The flags look similar, and the other 3 columns are Venezuela. And this is how many hours at the minimum wage you need to work to buy a kilo of chicken, a dozen eggs, or a kilo of cheese. Right now, the minimum wage, in the last number, it buys 330 calories a day. It used to buy 70,000 calories a day, so it has gone to something like 1% of its caloric value. If you assign 100% of it to the cheapest available calorie, which at the moment is yucca. And as a consequence, people have been leaving the country. We use a Facebook API to identify Venezuelans abroad. can identify any expats of any country abroad. And there are 3.3 million Facebook users, Venezuelan Facebook users abroad. So using their socio-demographic characteristics and knowing the socio-demographic characteristics of Facebook users in Venezuela, we infer that there must be something like 5.2 million Venezuelans that have left the country. This is about 15% of the population. If that was the US, it would be 45 million people. And this is using Twitter. We take Venezuelans that lived that tweeted from Venezuela and only from Venezuela in the year 2017, and we ask where are they in 2018. And we have, our latest number is that we've had over, the number there goes up to October, and it had 10% of the people having left the country in that calendar year. So again, this is the rationale I've explained to you, how things break. And obviously, it's important to know how things break to figure out how you can repair them. So obviously, the first thing you would want to do is to recreate the invisible hand. Another way of saying it, you need to re-empower society with rights. You need to re-empower society with rights so that, because the market mechanism is one where somebody's needs is another person's livelihood. It's a system where each one earns a living by doing things that other people find valuable. If you break that, then nobody has an incentive to doing anything for anybody else, because if you're going to work for 300 calories, you better stay in bed and save your calories, because you're going to consume 2,000 calories if you stay in bed. And so you need to restore economic rights. That should increase GDP. But you need to restart this engine. Imagine Venezuela as being a Uber driver that has his car, has his willingness to drive, but doesn't have the gasoline. So his car goes unused and his labor goes unused. So if we give him the gasoline, we'll have more raw materials, more barley to produce, and hence GDP will go up. Tax revenues will go up, and international financing would also help fund the government, which will stop the monetary printing, which will stabilize prices, which will recover the financial system and allow the economy to recover. So restoring rights and international financial assistance could turn the situation around. So that's in essence. I'm not going to go into the details of policy. I can talk until next year about it, but let me maybe stop there, because I'm sure I've gone over time, but Dan didn't let me know. But that's how I think Venezuela collapsed, and that's how I think Venezuela can turn around. Thank you very much.
I'd say great analysis. Enough said, really. Yeah. I mean, there's some things I don't necessarily agree with. But generally speaking, great analysis. I'd say, I mean, he definitely incorporated the imports, exports, so he's in essence involving the outside world, and so he's looking at a bigger picture already than Venezuela. I mean, that's just great analysis. I don't really have anything to say. I do wish he had focused more on the inner relationship between the collapse and cross-discipline autocatalysis, but because I thought that would, like, if we look at it and we see it, we may see it, but if we look at it and continue to analyze it with that in mind, then we see more. There's more connections. It's not just like one cross. So, for instance, like, say two magnets interact in a certain way, and that's related to how two humans interact, which I talk about in another video. But those two magnets can have a lot of different characteristics where we can then analyze, say, their magnetic strength. So if one's stronger than the other, how they then interact rather than if they're equal strengths. their distance of separation, their angle that they're facing. There's all sorts of things that can be extrapolated by looking more deeply at a particular process and the interactions of the systems. So it's always worth continuing to look with that in mind, and not just stopping like after the parallel is made. There's always more parallels because it's infinite in detail, and so we can always extrapolate more. But I mean, good start, great analysis, great analogy, great parallel. I mean, that was, I don't know how many times I see people talk about parallels like that in a real way, about trying to demonstrate something that's happening in a system. So, I mean, kudos to this guy. Let's see what kind of questions we get. I might just stop soon.
Ross Burdorf, I'm on the board here at the Institute. So what's it, I mean, is there a study on what's it take to get, you know, the cause of this problem? So what's it take to get him politically out of office? I mean, how bad does it have to get for, you know, that kind of change for this to, that'd be an important question.
I think that there is a PhD dissertation, I'm sure that somebody will write, on the following question. We have thought that if the economy does poorly, there's political change. And so we take that as, we don't know where we learned that from, but we believe it. I think that might be, and there is evidence electorally that if a president goes into an election in a recession, that is bad for the incumbent. That performance of the economy is good for the incumbent. When it's good, bad when it's bad, etc. We know that. That we know from democracy, elections, etc., open societies. We don't know that about totalitarian regimes. So what happens in a collapse is that the government becomes weaker, but society also becomes weaker. And if what matters is the relative power of the government over society, it's not at all obvious that deterioration leads to regime change. So the idea that things have to get worse for this to turn around may not be there, because even you see now this last week, the army, which have a salary of about 2 minimum wages or so, they are allowed to loot, so they're criminal organizations. You know, they at least have some relative power in something, so they're not budging. So I think that we should this question. We have seen many governments fall. We have seen very few collapses of this magnitude. So if that theory was right, we should have seen regime change long ago. So we need to revisit that theory. Yeah.
I don't think he asked theoretically. I think he asked if a regime change would do something in this positive. Just a different question.
André de Roos, sabbatical fellow at SFI right now. My question was about how your analysis, which I really appreciated, thank you for that lecture, how that actually reflects on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because that was a system where there were no economic rights, and then there was an attempt to actually somehow establish economic rights again, but it didn't really work out that well, I would say, because the majority of the Russian population is still suffering from hunger quite a bit. So how do you see that you can actually escape the scenario that unfolded after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
So first of all, economic collapses in the Soviet Union happened after the political collapse. This is happening before political change. But I think that they are very related. I would put it to you that as causes go, a fundamental cause for the collapse of the Soviet Union was the decline in the price of oil in 1986. And that led to problems of the Venezuelan kind, right? Which led to dissatisfaction, and led to the collapse of the regime. It led to the inability of Russia to sort of like help Poland, Hungary, and East Germany at the time. So it said, no, go ask resources in the West. But, you know, we are in trouble. So that led to these other countries peeling off first, and then the Soviet Union collapsing in 91. That led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. led to an enormous economic disruption because value chains did not recognize, republic borders, but suddenly they became hard borders because each one of the units didn't have enough dollars or enough rubles to buy from each other. And in that sense, it resembles very much what happened after the end of the Second World War. This is a period that also needs a lot of attention. After the war ended in 1945, the Americans declared victory and said, okay, we've given you freedom, we've given you democracy, we're providing occupation services also in parts of Germany and Japan. But, so go ahead and recover. And the economies collapsed after the war. And they collapsed because they were all short of dollars. And they couldn't import, so they couldn't export, so they couldn't import, because they couldn't export, because they couldn't import. And it was in 1948 that the US came with the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan did marvels. It recovered those economies in no time. It was an amazingly successful intervention. But it happened in 48. That Marshall Plan didn't happen in Russia. So I think that Russia is sort of like what would have happened after the Second World War without a Marshall Plan. And I think that Venezuela needs a Marshall Plan because it's this autocatalysis that needs to be restarted. John. Yeah, and then I go there.
So one wonderful talk. One could ask 1,000 questions, but I want to ask about one particular topic. So debt played a big role in the collapse that as you pointed out. So in Greece, debt played a big role. In the American financial crisis, debt played a big role. So I wondered if you could say a few more words about the debt. Who were the lenders who didn't foresee that there would be a problem paying the debt back? And once Maduro falls and you're back in power, how are you going to deal with all the debt?
So, I mean, it's quite a condemnation of financial markets, the fact that they made so many resources available to Venezuela. I must say, I skipped over it, but I had a picture of the country risk in Venezuela. And it was amazingly high during the boom, during the oil boom. And then obviously when oil collapsed, it went stratospherically. And the country, for example, its last bond issue was in May 2017. It placed $900 million at a yield to maturity of 47% in dollars. It was purchased by Goldman Sachs. I wrote an op-ed at the time about hunger bonds, and they are still called the hunger bonds. So if you trade them, the hunger bonds. But no one, they had no useful resources that could have generated 47% returns. But it still went ahead. So China played a very big role. China lent $60+ billion in the most corrupt and obscure way possible. There are some clauses in those laws, in those loans, that say that revealing the text of the loan would constitute an act of default. Anyway, so there's nothing nice to say about Chinese loans and Russian loans, but still about over half of it was market loans. So I think that the country is completely over-indebted, and it cannot get out of it without a massive restructuring with a very, very large haircut. And I think that all the people who are going to put money in, say the new money, is going to demand that the old money be wiped out. And I think that it happened in Greece. This is much worse than Greece. It didn't happen enough, I agree. But because in part, a lot of that debt was also internal in Greece. And you would have wiped out the Greek banks or the European banks. So in this case, there's no domestic debt because inflation has wiped it out. Hyperinflation has wiped it out, so at least we have that. We don't have a domestic financial system that can go broke because we don't have a domestic financial system. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Sid Redner. I'm a resident faculty member. I want to ask a very different kind of question, is that Venezuela is horrible. It's a horrible collapse, but there's also other ones in Latin America which are very prominent. Is there some cultural aspect to this that plays a role? And I'm sort of very much influenced by John Crow's book, The Epic of Latin America.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that you haven't seen very many of these things. The recessions I showed to you in Chile and Argentina, we understand sort of like the macroeconomics of them, and we understand what makes emerging markets relatively more fragile. in the 90s, I developed this theory they called the original sin, which is the fact that they borrow abroad in foreign currency, and that when they get into trouble, the currency weakens, so the debt becomes more expensive, so it becomes harder to pay, so the currency weakens, so the debt becomes more expensive, and that's why they end up in these bad equilibria, and that part of it is sort of like an inadequate integration to global financial markets. But I wouldn't say culturally, the U.S. is soon going to pass a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. We in Latin America are profligate at, I think the profligate countries get at 60%. The debt is much more expensive, so it's hard to get more, but it's not, I wouldn't say that, running the kind of fiscal deficits that the U.S. is running right now, in the middle of a boom, that would count in Latin America as super hyper irresponsible. Maybe because the U.S. has access to funding at a different rate and so on, but your current fiscal stance would be way more irresponsible than the standard Latin American policy. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, because I am from South America and I lived through some of the hyperinflation, so I was very interested by this picture. Perhaps it's simplistic, but I was thinking that what characterizes this as so unique is that perhaps it's similar to what happened in many places in South America, or has happened, but never before in a place with so much oil, so much richness, so much flexibility. I wonder whether this big collapse couldn't happen like this in other countries, because what this amount of oil allowed politically, you haven't talked very much about the
politics.
No, about the poverty, about the inequality, etc., and some of how all of that relates ultimately to manipulation, to corruption, to the way these kinds of governments can use and use badly all these resources. So I think there has been no country in all these, even the one in Chile, you can think of civil wars, you can think of political issues. Ultimately, I think what is very unique here is the resources that this government had when this collapse was initiated.
I mean, what happened to the oil sector is maybe a metaphor for the whole country. So you're sitting on huge potential, right? The largest oil reserves in the world, supposedly. So you're sitting on huge potential. And it requires some effort to get it out. You may not know how to do it. The world is full of people who know how to do it. So you just have to strike a deal. And we had a nationalized oil company. We nationalized it in the 70s. It was a fairly well-run oil company. It was meritocratic. The government didn't like this meritocracy. It thought that it had no respect for expertise. That's you've seen that in other places. No respect for expertise. So, and so they thought that all of these restrictions on getting hired, on being promoted, and so on, were just a ruse of those in power to keep control. So they ended up challenging them. They went on strike, and they fired 20,000 workers out of 35,000 workers, starting from the top. So they destroyed the whole human capital of the industry. And that, I think, started the process of collapsing that oil company. Because to produce oil, you need to have oil reserves. You also need some know-how and some collective know-how in a team that you're able to put together. But if this attack on the invisible hand also attacks those teams, you just cannot implement the needed technology to realize those gains. So yes, I think it was politics, if you want, that destroyed even the capacity to get the oil out, and that's why oil collapsed.
So listen, I'm sorry, we have to move on. I'm sorry, we're at the end of time, but I do, Ricardo,
yeah?
You were remarkably restrained in your comments about Maduro and Chavez, and just for 30 seconds, could you give us a sense of the scale of corruption in the current Maduro? Just give us a couple of anecdotes, because I think people may not appreciate just how heinous this particular government is.
Well, what do we know for a fact? We know for a fact that Chavez's bodyguard became the national treasurer. He eventually left to the U.S., was indicted on corruption, plea bargained, and declared having received $1.5 billion in bribes, which have now, most of those assets have been seized by the U.S. government. The vice president at the time was named as a drug kingpin, and his assets were seized. The government doesn't know what the assets are until they're sanctioned, and then the financial system.
What the fuck? The U.S. government's like, hey, you're taking bribes in this country over there. That's our bribes. Thanks a lot, bitch.
Tells the U.S. government what they found in. So they found $900 million in assets in the U.S. I presume that he didn't put all of his eggs in this basket. We have found some $4 billion in the private bank of Andorra. We found $1.5 billion in a bank in Bulgaria that we've seized. So these are just, we invest.
Sounds like par for the course, man.
More seriously, we invested $50 billion in the electrical grid and didn't increase electricity capacity by 1 kilowatt. So I cannot tell you what happened to the money. I can tell you what happened to the electricity. So I presume that this has been, corruption at gigantic scale.
Okay, join me in thanking Ricardo.
All right. I mean, that's kind of funny. He's heinous. And then he's like talking about bribes. I mean, not to defend the guy, but this is obviously a complex issue that I don't know what the political attitudes of the people that are asking questions and all in this video are, but like in terms of America, like if they actually believe that the United States government is somehow righteous and different. It's the same shit, just a different spin on it, different way about doing it. So I don't know. The United States is involved. To think that this happened without the invisible hand of the most powerful entities, if you will, or institutes in the world, basically competing over resources. I mean, they're just like stuck between a rock and a hard place, as they say, Venezuela. And to think of Venezuela as just this thing in a vacuum would be a mistake. Anyway, I'm out. That was interesting. Catch you all later for another one of these. Maybe I don't know, fall of the Roman Empire. That sounds interesting. Anyway, later.